The final season of Game of Thrones left a sour taste in most people's mouths. Whether you hated the ending or even enjoyed it, I don't think anyone will disagree with the statement that Game of Thrones was dead. No one seemed to talk about this show anymore, a show that had quite literally gripped the entire world. In 2018 and 19, pretty much everyone was high on Game of Thrones. It was the biggest and most popular TV show ever made. And coming into its final season, I don't think we've ever seen a TV series trending the way that Game of Thrones did. However, the season did not live up to people's expectations, and after the initial backlash, it seemed as though Game of Thrones had been lost in a void, never to be seen again. So many people who had previously loved the show couldn't even rewatch the earlier seasons because the sheer disappointment they felt from that last season, to them at least, ruined everything that came before it. Now, I am personally someone whose love for Game of Thrones has stayed quite active throughout these past 3 years. I've rewatched most of the earlier seasons many times, and while I've never thought that Season 8 is anywhere near the level of the rest of the show, I could still appreciate Game of Thrones as a whole. However, throughout this time I felt mostly alone in my adoration for Game of Thrones. But then out of these shadows emerged a flame that would shine so bright that millions would flock back to Westeros for yet another adventure. But what is it about the House of the Dragon that makes it so great? It has been releasing in a time where a lot of other popular TV shows have been coming out simultaneously, such as Rings of Power, She-Hulk, Andor, Dahmer, and many more. But still, House of the Dragon has solidified itself at the top. There are many reasons why this show is succeeding, and of course we can sit here and talk about the writing, the dialogue, the acting, the directing, the set designs, the costumes, the brilliant world and story that George Martin created, and so much more, but that would be boring, and everyone always talks about that. No, the real reason that House of the Dragon is good is because of incest. So today I want to discuss the good, the great, and the phenomenal aspects of House of the Dragon, but also some of the less good, great, and phenomenal aspects. Because this show isn't perfect, but it has the potential to truly become a masterpiece, if it makes sure it doesn't stumble along the way. But let's start with the positives, because that's more fun. Now, this show has taken its time to get going, and some may see that as a bad thing. Perhaps the first couple of episodes are a bit slow, and while yes, I don't think that's a bad thing. The Dance of the Dragons is one of the most influential periods in the Targaryen dynasty, but to do it justice, they needed to lay the perfect foundation for the conflict. They had to set up all the characters, the factions, the relationships, and ultimately, the conflict itself. And while the season hasn't ended yet, I can't imagine how they'd mess this up after producing 9 marvelous episodes. But yes, they decided to show us the whole story. Not every part of it, they do gloss over some details which we'll get to eventually. However, they decided to give us around 20 years worth of events to truly set up this historic civil war. However, by having this much setup, you run the risk of not being able to provide payoff. Essentially, since the real payoff from the setup will only really start in future seasons, you run the risk of boring your audience and not giving them satisfaction week in and week out. This risk is similar to that of Rings of Power, and just heads up, this video will reflect negatively on Rings of Power, but I will give that show the time it deserves in its own separate video. Rings of Power has also spent most of the first season setting up the central conflict that will only really start ramping up in future seasons. However, to me at least, it felt like the mixture of not having arrived at the central conflict yet and the many different storylines that they've been trying to build up has caused me to not been feeling that drama and satisfaction in every episode like I have with House of the Dragon. In Rings of Power, I have a hard time remembering what happened in each episode. It all sort of blends together in a way, but House of the Dragon solidifies each episode and gives us something to talk about, whether it be a powerful and significant moment such as Viserys' final walk, or a badass moment such as Daemon taking on an army single-handedly. Each episode feels unique and satisfying, and for me, when episodes release weekly, this is really important. Now you can say that this also leads to some of the episodes, or at least the time between the episodes, feeling rushed and underdeveloped. And you'd be correct in saying that. There are aspects that have kind of happened off screen and we're told to just go along with it, such as Otto being this mastermind and big player that we're told he is, and relationships such as Daemon and Laena, and Rhaenyra and Harwin Strong. This isn't a major gripe for me because the time cuts are implemented quite well, and everything that happens during the actual episodes is established and makes total sense. And that's the thing about this show. It's impactful. It moves us. That scene with Viserys walking into the Great Hall gripped me in a way that hasn't happened in a long time. Physically, this is the weakest we've ever seen Viserys, but yet this is also the strongest we've seen him as a king. The throne for once doesn't cut him, and despite being mere hours away from his death, he still stands strong to defend the most important thing in his life, Rhaenyra, who's a living reminder of his greatest regret, but also the only of his children whom he truly loves. This is such a powerful scene, and I don't remember the last time a new series has made me feel this way. Paddy Considine did an incredible job with this performance. If he's not at the very least nominated for an Emmy, then something is truly wrong. He brought to life Viserys in his own unique way, and despite his flaws, we couldn't help but feel emotional when he took his final breath. But it isn't just Paddy Considine who's great. All the actors are doing a fantastic job. Of course, with a couple of exceptions, but they're children, so it doesn't really matter. I can forgive children. But Matt Smith is another standout, and while I thought at first that the white wig looked ridiculous on him, at least he's the only Targaryen in the show who actually looks inbred, so that's nice. No, but Daemon is that one character who steals the show in every scene he's in. But I also want to acknowledge Millie Alcock and Emily Carey, along with Emma D'Arcy and Olivia Cook later on. All four have done an amazing job bringing Rhaenyra and Alicent to life. The time jump transition was smooth, and in general, the performances in the show are just top notch. This show already has the potential to be as great as Game of Thrones, perhaps even surpass it. I mean, this first season has honestly been one of the best first seasons to a TV series ever, and while it probably wouldn't have been able to flourish like this if it hadn't been for Game of Thrones setting up this world, the rules, the families, the terminology, and all the other pieces of exposition that House of the Dragon could happily skip past and delve straight into the drama. But even taking that into consideration, House of the Dragon's potential is sky high. However, there are just a few things that the showrunners need to be wary of going into the future seasons. For example, the dragons. From what I've heard, the Dance of Dragons is a conflict where the dragons are very influential, not just as tools of mass destruction, but also as players in this war. We'll see dragons go up against each other and will need to be invested, so I hope they spend some time exploring the individual dragons just a little bit, and their relationships with their riders. I know we got some great scenes with Vhagar, but despite knowing the names of some of the other dragons, we don't really have much of a relationship with them. I just hope the dragons get fleshed out more so that the coming war will have even higher stakes. Another potential risk I see is the fans themselves. No matter how much this first season has won us over, people still haven't forgotten the Game of Thrones ending, and I think people are still wary. They don't want to get too attached just yet, and so the showrunners also can't get too complacent. The fans love the show now, but if the show doesn't keep innovating and improving, then that love can quickly turn to hate. Now, House of the Dragon has the obvious benefit of covering a story that has an ending. It's already laid out, and so it'll be easier to nail the ending than it was for Game of Thrones. But essentially what I'm trying to say is that they just need to stay focused. This show has all the potential in the world, and I really want it to live up to that potential. Wouldn't that just be great? Now, obviously, I think it's a testament to how awesome this show is that my criticisms are so few and far in between. Other than a couple of weird details such as that really dark episode where it was difficult to see what was going on unless you had an OLED TV, or how the Kingsguard never seemed to really care when Alicent and Rhaenyra are literally at each other's throats. They just stand and watch while the future queen-to-be gets her arms slashed open. No, but this first season has ignited a passion for the world of A Song of Ice and Fire that we thought was lost, and since it turned out to be so damn good, we naturally become curious for the other upcoming spin-off shows, rather than worrisome, which I admit I was before this show premiered. I was thinking that they were going to MCUify Game of Thrones, and while I love the MCU, I'm glad that that doesn't seem to be the case. House of the Dragon has so far overcome every obstacle in its way, and it's no easy feat to have outviewed and outperformed Rings of Power, which is literally the most expensive TV show of all time, based upon the most influential fantasy story of all time. One of the main complaints about Rings of Power is that they change way too many things about the canon, and while House of the Dragon has also changed things from canon, it's not to the same degree and it still serves the overall story. This is not to say that you can't enjoy Rings of Power more, that's absolutely your prerogative. If you don't like the gritty and realistic fantasy style of Game of Thrones, and if you're more into higher fantasy that feels more magical, then I can see you enjoying Rings of Power more. But I think the common consensus, at least in pop culture, is that House of the Dragon has outshone all of its competition, and has so far raised the bar for what fantasy shows can be once again, being a very deserving and satisfying spin-off to Game of Thrones. Now, with one episode left of the show, I can't see it not nailing the ending, especially with how devious, chilling, and epic that penultimate episode was. The stage is set for a legendary ending to the first season. Everything this series has achieved so far has been touched by gold. My only gripe is that they need to stop making the members of a highly incestuous family so goddamn attractive. First we had Daenerys and Jon, now we have this tomfoolery. No, but seriously, I don't think people react appropriately to these things. Instead of being a little bit weirded out, we create stan accounts instead. It's whack. But anyways, I hope you all enjoyed. And if you did, then please do leave a like on this video and leave a comment down below about your own thoughts on House of the Dragon. Check out my Patreon if you want to be more involved in this channel, and as always, thanks to my Patrons, which includes our turf captain, Ben Joseph. But without further ado, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe and peace out.